It's the quarterfinals. And with it, episode 13 of the Daily Sweepers for Worlds 2021. Couple of things to note. I'll be putting down over here. Oh, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. Hi. For those who don't know, this is Vision Denial, a channel where we just talk about international League of Legends competitions. I'm Sam, and usually, not more really usually, but I do a bunch of videos, usually doing analysis, some dramatic readings, and for the Daily Sweepers, I've been usually doing some very tame dramatic readings of my notes, usually fairly simple notes, not super in-depth, and then I would try to elaborate more off of that from this. It's the quarterfinals. And a couple of things to note for those who are unfamiliar to the stuff that I do. I have highlights of the games that I've played here. So, spoilers ahead, there will be results of the games themselves down below. With that, though, the highlights that are there were created by the VCS, the Vietnamese Championship Series. Do follow their page, their website, their channel, the whole thing, all of their socials and all the rest. They're fantastic. Their league is great. They haven't been able to play internationally for a long time, but they do wonderful stuff. Whole lots of fun. The usual format, like I mentioned, is usually a short dramatic reading with some elaboration. The best of fives for the quarters, semis, and finals, I thought would be better, more so to say, for me to read a more elaborate set of notes, the ones that I usually keep for myself, that would have a bit of a more in-depth go for it, because I didn't read those for the best of fives for the play-ins. They didn't really seem all that competitive or that important, given that I had a very seeping suspicion that the meta was going to change, and so it did not matter all too much for them, because part of the notes for me are more of how do the teams adapt from game to game. In this case, I am going to be approaching it this way. So some of each of the games are going to be a lot longer in terms of reads that I do, but hopefully it'll give a larger, more in-depth thought process of how I look at these games. If it's any familiar consolation, this will be similar to how I did all of my analysis for the Road to MSI series. That being said, let's get started with our first game of the series so far. Oh, and also to note, I'll be separating each game analysis with a draft analysis and then the game analysis. So that said, we'll go today for our series of T1 versus Homolife, which starts with T1 picking blue side and Homolife getting red side, T1 being the upper seed. We'll get the choice selection for this game, and I'll have over here a screenshot of the draft, but we'll go through them one by one. Now, for the draft, Homolife's red round 1 bans suggest, as they focus a Yuumi, Lee Sin, and Twisted Fate, that they're trying to avoid having to deal with picks and being split up at any given point from rotations, and to me suggests that they're going for a neutral objective focused composition. While as T1, however, having to deal with avoiding Silas, LeBlanc, and Jarvan, taking those away allows them more opportunities to siege or approach side lanes in a way that doesn't have to require putting more resources or having to give resources. Taking away the LeBlanc will require more resources to avoid, and Silas would take some resources that you would usually use to enable your composition. Now, T1's round 1 picks have some solid skirmish comp in mind with some scaling. Taking into account Aphelios and Graves usually gives the amount of skirmishing power that is needed as well as adding the benefit that Aphelios' scaling inherently allows them for a lot of team fights, while as a lot of the abilities that Graves has allowing for a good amount of team fighting and flexibility in terms of those options. It tends to also lead some ability to take into a look of some sieging options, with Graves and Aphelios both having the ability to do siege, and Talon being a great mobility around the map to help with the sidelines. Hama Life have a solid team fight in mind. It's good for some neutrals. The ability of having Aurelia and Jin Zhao for some zoning and abilities to dive the backline and giving some space to Misfortune for her bullet time gives a great amount of space for that. And with that in mind, going into the round 2 bans, Hama Life ban out some strong wave manipulators. Getting rid of Rise and Azir allows for the ability for them to get rid of most of the options in terms of their side laning and wave manipulation, which would have been a problem in terms of setting up for neutrals. If they're always having to fight for space and vision while their turrets are being taken in, it does not matter how many neutral objectives they gather if their base is in shambles from it. T1, on their hand, ban solid engage options. And this is a good round 2 option for banning that T1 lean on regularly. Part of this to aim against the weaker points that Hama Life have in terms of lack of coordination being one of the weaker team fighting teams going into Worlds, regardless of which round you're talking about. Now, following that, in terms of the picks, T1 with some solid skirmish comp and good lane survival after they've rounded out their composition with Orianna Thresh, needs to gain some leads towards their bot side to properly use the scaling and wave manipulation in other lanes. What do I mean by that? Aphelios itself does require a little bit of amount of legwork going into the laning phase in the early game. Without the particular legwork, scaling into the late game is not viewed as a possibility or will take a lot more work. Graves and Orianna's inherent survivability and strong presence within their lanes does not require a lot of attention, and so part of that process is so that they don't have to focus too much attention towards helping Aphelios, and having strong side lane pressures would require that Aphelios has been given enough attention bot side. Hama Life, on their end, pick some stuff that requires a lot more setup to properly team fight. The pick for Zoe and Braum leaves them with some issues regarding the abilities to dive into the backline. It does require a lot more poking options, which is not favorable towards the MO of Jin Zhao and Aurelia, who do want to create setups and dive in. That being said, this comp will require some topside focus in order to make up for it. Because of the aforementioned requirement of Aurelia and Jin Zhao to dive in, if there's focus for that side of the map to have gotten gold and proper leads, then it does not matter as much in terms of the weakened ability of Misfortune and Braum team fighting. Their early skirmish power may be there, but during the team fighting setup, they will have a harder time setting up around neutrals, which is the main focus of this composition. And with that, we get into the game. Game starts. Now, while T1 have stronger vision and are creating stronger passive leads, Hama Life are looking for a lot of skirmishes to make up for it and stay proactive. Hama Life are properly allocating focus on the lanes needed, but T1 have been using their stronger map movement to secure lane and herald leads, using it to accelerate their bot duo fantastically. Hama Life have good but shallow vision and answers the early herald with a first strike, but are struggling to keep up as we enter the mid-game transition. Granted, just as I wrote this, Vista outplays a clumsy tower dive, and Hama Life gained back some deficit that was accrued. Because of that mistake made, laning was slightly extended, and first tower was secured by Hama Life, who are now responding to T1's map movements well and get the second herald. This has a secondary effect of T1's vision becoming a little weaker while Hama Life is still a little shallow for their end. T1 really leaned into their team fight and siege strengths to force Hama Life to fight them and avoid a neutral fight altogether. I wrote this note and I'll expand on this a little bit. Part of the issues coming into this particular setup after their mistake, because Hama Life had secured 2 neutrals at this point, a dragon early and the herald, they had gained control of the pacing. And so to avoid having to do any more neutral fights and avoid them from having any time to do any setup, T1 focused on sieging and forcing that pressure to them for them to come towards their fighting. Hama Life made the error to team fight instead of focusing on their neutrals at the 16-minute mark. They've now used this mistake to balloon leads in the side lanes and garnering stronger vision. T1 with this have Kana become online and each member with items ready to keep up pressure as we enter the post 20 minutes of mid-game and transition to the late game. Hama Life are having a hard time answering the lane assignments to even use their neutral objective-based composition. Shallow vision and strong vision denial means that shallow vision from their part and strong vision denial from T1 means that Chovy is stuck side laning on Zoe instead of setting up picks. As such, T1 can secure better neutrals and pick themselves. Now, the 24-minute mark, T1 make a rather risky call to take a Baron after a pick. And Chovy is still up at this point. They keep 2 buffs from them, but Hama Life are wise to punish an over-aggressive move. Now, the lack of wave clear make it very hard for Hama Life to answer the Baron push, and T1, despite their mistake, keep up a strong vision and a very efficient Baron use. And with 2.7k and 3 turrets down, makes a very good Baron power play. Hama Life try using their composition strength to deny soul point, but don't have the setup and at all despite the strength of their composition. And T1 can test and secure it and use this mistake to grab mid inhibitor. And as we enter the post 30-minute mark and solidly into the late game, Hama Life are being picked off easily as they can't go forward with an 8k deficit and a second Baron for T1. T1 at this point should be able to close out the game. And as I type this, a solid 2-lane pressure with Baron and take a solid engage and cleanly close out the game. And with that, T1 in 1-0. Going into game 2, T1 will need to clean up their vision early game and some of their aggression, some of their over-aggression that would usually, because of this, cause the momentum for their team to slow down. Hama Life on their end can opt into a different compositional style and should focus on enabling their bot side instead. And that's where usually their team shines, the combination of Chovy and Deft. And then we head to game 2. Game 2. Let's take a look at their draft for game 2. Hama Life go and have blue side selection for this game, as they have lost the previous one, and then T1 are relegated to red. The round 1 bans of Jace, Yuumi, and Graves from Hama Life focus on banning any siege and side lane, which suggests another attempt at neutral and team fight focus more this time. T1 banning any options of skirmishes and picks look again to be playing for the side lanes and team fights, which suggests that both of these teams have a very solid idea of how they want to encounter both of them. T1 having banned Lee Sin, Twisted Fate, and Jarvan. The round 1 picks for Hama Life suggest that they are looking for more skirmish heavy. Having picked LeBlanc, Varus, and Jin Zhao, LeBlanc and Jin Zhao have a stronger emphasis on their ability to skirmish and pick individual champions as they're moving around the map. Varus being a cleanup team fighter or a cleanup ADC. Now, while T1 have picked up Poppy in this case, having added Aphelios, Lissandra, and Poppy to answer Xin Zhao, but their first two picks, as I mentioned with Aphelios and Lissandra, still suggest that they're looking for team fighting. Poppy still having some of those options, it is more to help deny and prevent any of the skirmish options from being successful. Poppy is a very strong last pick as an answer towards both the LeBlanc and the Xin Zhao. Now, Homolife on the round 2 banning Thresh ban out their the Aphelios laning option, and also Kennen to avoid any particular extra team fighting options. While as T1 banning again the Rakan and Leona are just going to keep doing the same thing round after round. Vista is strong on support champions like these, and so to avoid any particular headaches, that's what they'll aim for. Round 2 picks, Homolife are doubling down into their skirmish and pick some options for what I would opt is some very weak team fighting with Nautilus and Renekton, as they're strong engage options with Nautilus, but is the only engage option with Nautilus. And if he goes all in and is not the proper setup, it's rough with them. And T1 on their end, opting into some side lane pressure, also some disengage, means they want more of a 1-4 kind of game with some weak side team fighting, allowing themselves to team fight on reds for their 4 comp weaker on the 5v5 front, and hoping that Gwen's pressure will force them to be able to take 4v3 or 4v2 fights if come be. And with that, we head to the game. There's a level 1. T1 calling out a possible invade group 5 topside, but nothing happens. There's a solid and calm early game with some solid vision on both sides, but lane fights are creating precarious scenarios that give a slight edge to T1. Homolife are playing map movement and control over the mid lane super well, but despite some good neutral setups, opt into waiting for T1 to start Herald, which is really weird. Homolife have decided that their neutral setups in their skirmishes are their strong suit for this team, and yet don't seem to be opting into it themselves. T1, on their part, didn't do the proper setups and are punished fairly early to do so. But as T1 will do, they'll do teamfight things and out teamfight literally everyone despite the setups that they have. They'll steal the Herald, and now this means that Gumayusi gets first herd gold also. As we enter the mid-game transition, 2.5k lead for T1 and full map control. T1 with solid lane assignments are making it hard for Homolife to answer. Homolife on their end have strong defensive vision, but since they're playing defensively, T1 can just set up neutrals properly and gain foothold on teamfights and secure the second Herald. By the time the 17 minutes roll around, Homolife have lost control of the game and can't approach any teamfights without being blown up, and are now 5k behind with 0 neutral objectives to their name, despite the fact that they've been drafting 2 games in a row with neutral objectives in mind. We've come to a series of fights that Homolife are opting into that T1 are happy to secure, are very happy to have, and secure 2 Drakes and complete river control. Homolife do not have the resources to contest anything at this point, and wisely choose to punish a cross-map play where Kana was split pushing as Baron is being secured. T1 making strong use of the Baron at this point, have 5 turrets to 1, hold on a very strong hold on every lane, soul point, and now we're entering the 25-minute mark with an 8k lead. Now, Homolife recognizes that picks and 1-for-1 trades are the only way to slow down the game and try to accrue enough resources to answer T1's aggression and solid control and proactivity. T1 do not let go, and despite the lead, are not sieging as well as they could, and as such, opt into forcing Hololive to play into them. I have mixed feelings regarding this particular strategy. Going into this, they could have very much put the pressure on, kept sieging, kept going, and this might have extended the game into a place where Hololive would not be able to gain the resources enough or make any risks for it. But T1 decided to force the mistakes out of Hololive to speed up the game in some sense. They take the less clean approach to the game, but by doing so, managed to speed up the game and up the pace with it. Now, going around the Baron and forcing Hololive to take a bad fight is the play for them. T1 ace them cleanly and are able to close out the game. It's not the best close, but forcing Hololive to make a choice between being choked out by Baron or being aced at Baron makes it easier to keep up the pace and avoid any comeback scaling. And with that, T1 are now 2-0. Hololive should look into a more proactive bot side draft. Again, I've mentioned this is where their stronger side is. They have to make sure that Chovy have the ability to play on top of it. Deft is relegated into a secondary role, and if you avoid him from having a secondary role, they might have the pivot they kind of need to be able to come back. T1 on their end are in their element, and they just need to clean up some of their neutral setup and some of the vision play to avoid any potential comeback that could have happened during this match. And with that, we head to the next game where Hololive, again having lost and getting side selection, still opt to going into blue side, with T1 heading to red side. And then we head to draft for game 3. Fans in round 1 are suggesting that Hololive are prepared to do the similar thing again. They ban Jace, Yuumi, and Graves, and T1, in kind, are just going to answer with the Lee Sin, Twisted Fate, and Jarvan. Both teams now completely certain about their roles at this point, and this is big red flags. I've mentioned previously in some of these best of 5 analysis, the team that does the least amount of adaptation, especially if you're the losing team, not great. For round 1 picks, Hololive are deciding to opt into the same early game style draft, and while Olaf holds a better early game team fighting, it hurts their late game options, which means if they lose the early game, like the trend has been happening so far, or even lose the mid game, they're going to lose the late game much more. And they still opt to giving Varys LeBlanc as their other 2 picks. And as much as you're still enabling Chovy with this pick, you're hurting Deft and showing that you're still going to be playing up into the top side of the map. T1 answers with also a jungle change on their end, picking up Talon, making it much easier to match and play early neutrals, but hurts aspects of their team fighting. As much as Talon has shown some ability for team fighting, it's much stronger to use it for picks specifically. But considering they've picked up the Fellas and Lysandra, then that's totally fine. At this point, they just need to round it out at that to just make sure that the team fighting can stay clear. Round 2, T1 banned the same thing, which is the appropriate move. At this point, nothing about Hololive's drafting has suggested that doing anything for your round 2 draft should be changed at any given point. I don't like that there's a lack of adaptability, but T1 being on the upper end and Hololive not doing any adaptation when they're the losing team suggests to me that T1 is happy to just keep up what's going on. Now, Hololive, however, decide to ban Gwen to help their lanes even more, which is unfortunate because they're banning Gwen, which I don't think was the crux of the issue, and still keep the cannon as a ban. And she tells me that they've made the mistake already. Right? So they allow T1 to have the thresh for their Aphelios again, rounding out their composition very easily to help out their lanes more. And Homolov opted into a weaker version of their previous composition, taking up Braum and Renekton. Braum, being a fantastic pick for a lot of disengage, unfortunately has to contend with the fact that the only disengaging that will be happening is for the Varus, who is going to be left alone for the most part. Having a Renekton go in with a LeBlanc and Olaf just means that with a stronger team fight on the other end, T1 choosing to double down on the team fighting with a stronger version of their previous comp, having picked up the Gnar at this point. It's not looking good for them. The game starts. Homolef this time attempt a level 1 play. T1's preparations from the previous game don't seem so wild. It usually isn't. Now, they attempt a level 1 play this time to gain vision and some information, but not much more. It's a very timid play with their level 1. Now granted, Homolife has a better control of this game during the early levels. Lanes are not out of control, and jungle matchups allow for an easier time keeping up with vision and securing early Drake and first Herald. Already a better approach to their compositions they've had for 3 games. Despite that, T1 are also still keeping up with vision and are ahead of gold, and by the 10-minute mark from small laning choices that were answers to the neutral plays that Helmalife were going for. Now, T1 should start setting up more proactive plays, and Helmalife needs to upkeep this pace. Oh, as foretold, T1 creates a proactive play in the bot lane, focusing their win conditions well, and they gain first turret for the 3rd time in a row, and first blood for Gumayusi and the 2nd Drake. And then Chovy almost gets solo killed by Kana randomly. And Homolife are attempting global plays that are just being answered by a better T1. As we enter the mid-game transition, T1 are just outmaneuvering Homolife, and they need to find a better approach to the game that isn't just reliant on Herald plays at this point. And said reliance on Herald plays has really hurt Homolife now, who had a T1 contest them, steal a 4-root Aphelios by Gumayusi, and the cleanest team fight from T1 now propels them to a 4.5k lead after using the Herald and securing 4 kills. This is just so absolutely weird. Homolife are making these risks that are unnecessary that T1 are always happy to just do the fringe play. T1, as usual, with intelligent lane assignments and wave manipulation, suffocate Homolife of as many resources. And this is already such a better vision game by them that adds on to it to such an oppressive level of it's an absolutely ridiculous matchup from them. The level of vision denial out of T1 is so good, it forces Homolife to fight a bad Baron team fight. T1 secure the Baron and a 5-4-1 ace, and now a 9.5k lead going into the late game transition at 23 minutes. While T1 just secures Soul Point. T1 in this series are so good at using the Baron and end the power play with bot side inhibitor. And there's a 4.3k power play, ballooning the lead to 10,500. All the while, they keep up the pressure and don't let go of the tempo at any given point. Sadly, no matter how proactive Homolife play at this point, their comp has 0 options to engage or to create any solid picks against the safety options that exist for every role on the side of T1. Especially with this 10.5k deficit. It also doesn't help that this comp cannot team fight at all. There is such a lack of engage with only some disengage options for them. So long as T1 keep control, they can do the same thing as the last game. And for Home Life, they'll have to choose between suffocation from a Baron, losing Soul Point, or fighting either and losing. And unfortunately, Home Life choose none of those options, as T1 takes the Baron, flanks Home Life to take a team fight and kills them, grabs the souls as the minions are destroying their base, and then they end the game winning on all of Home Life's losing options. When I say they didn't even get the chance to contest Baron, they barely even made it to the river before they got flanked while Baron was already secured, killed 3 of them, grabbed Soul Point, minions destroying their base. And I know I repeated myself, but you have to understand how absolutely dominant this was. This was so ridiculous. T1 go 3-0 and head to the semifinals. This was so incredibly dominant. So, my thoughts from this? Well, congrats T1. I think this was an unfortunate circumstances of part of the things that worry me about Home Life and later will worry me about Gen G, but this is neither here nor there, is their lack of adaptability and their reliance on picking a composition that is strictly for one thing, but opting in to do team fighting consistently. And especially against like T1, when they straight up did not learn from their mistakes against them in the gauntlet in the regional qualifier, it makes it very weird for them to come in and just choose twice in a row the same kind of composition, almost like roll for roll, but just slightly worse on the second go, but also pick the similar winning conditions for all 3 games. Your win conditions should not be the same every single time. You should be opting into different playstyles. And T1, recognizing that they didn't have to do very much, there were some slight tweaks here, but mostly off of properly answering the bans that were thrown at them. And because there was no contest from T1, it's kind of hard to measure in what will happen. And we'll get a sense of it in 2 days when they're going against Damwon versus Mad, but T1 being the only team to have beaten Damwon since MSI for a best of 5, I think T1 will have a good solid go, considering this is a much better form from them than this in the entire go of it that we've seen so far. I honestly think that this is more of a tell on how to, and I think I mentioned it in the previous video, of like the hallmark of a strong team is a team that takes the lead that they have and absolutely balloons it without stopping. And T1, once they had a lead, and a solid lead at that, they never let it go at any given point. I think that they should be working on the way that they close their games. I do like the strategy of forcing your opponents to make a bad decision that will close out a game faster, but those tend to lead to very risky options long term. And for teams that are better at coming back or equally or better at team fighting, which the remaining of these teams that are left up into the top 8 are much better than Home Life at team fighting, so they won't have the chance to do that in the semifinals, let alone the finals. I think that if they work on being able to close out their games more, we might see a scarier T1. That and also the lack of consistent vision bothered me. And part of it is that Home Life were answering the visions properly, denying as much as they can. But given how much of a lead and how much pressure T1 were up, the fact that their vision was not as oppressive as it was until they got to game 3 tells me that there's a little bit of work, just a smidgens. Home Life on their end, I hope that most of your team stays the same going into next year and you just get a better coordination, or if anything changes, just have a stronger sense of your bot side play. The fact that deft is relegated to a secondary role is not great. If I was to give a player of the series, I'd probably give it to Kana, who, even though it doesn't look like he did a lot, between Kana and Keria, helped keep the map pressure at an all-time high, having to answer where Homolife was properly targeting their win conditions. Kana was just deciding to say no and nullified any attempts at doing so. And on top of it, caused a lot of pressure for them to focus Kana exclusively for the third game. So that's my... I can understand some of you will look at Gumayusi and say, oh, this guy was popping off, because he sure was, but the entirety of T1 was playing fantastically. You guys let me know in the comments down below. Who did you think was a player of the game? Were you as equally disappointed by Homolife's approach to things? I'd like to hear what you have to say. Otherwise, thank you all for watching. I really appreciate those of you who do. If you did like the video, like and subscribe. And with that, I'll see you all for the next series tomorrow of Royal Never Give Up versus Edward Gaming.